Hello and welcome to Security Analysis. I am Uday Bhaskar. This week, the focus is on one part of Asia that does not receive adequate comprehensive attention. And here the reference is to Central Asia. Yes, there is a lot of focus and attention paid to Afghanistan because of the current developments and the US withdrawal and so on. But Central Asia as a composite region does not quite receive the same kind of attention that other parts of Asia do. And as it happens this week, we have two back-to-back events, both in Central Asia. One is the meeting of the foreign ministers of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which took place in Tajikistan. The Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, had attended this meeting. And this was followed by the connectivity meeting held in Uzbekistan. Both these, of course, are taking place even as the violence in Afghanistan is simmering. And Dr. Jaishankar, when he spoke in Tajikistan at the SCO Foreign Ministers Forum, cautioned that Afghanistan's future should not become its past. And this, I think, is a very prudent kind of caution, because as of now, the near future in Afghanistan, particularly for its women and the girl child, looks a bit bleak. To discuss all these issues, we have with us a very experienced diplomat, Ambassador Neelam Deo, who's been India's ambassador to Denmark and other countries in West Africa. She's also served in many parts of the world. And after retirement from the Foreign Service, she is the co-founder of a very, I would say, well-known think tank in Mumbai, Gateway House. Ambassador, welcome to this program.
Thank you.
What I'll request you is that, we have enough time to, I think, look at this whole thing in a comprehensive way. First, the SCO Foreign Ministers meeting and the deliberations there, and later on, the connectivity. So if you could just share your assessment of the outcome, where again, I think the terrorism issue came up in a big way. And given the fact that the SCO, which was under the aegis of China, also supported by Russia, of which India is a member, along with Pakistan, what can they do about the very complex and tangled issue of terrorism in the region? Ambassador?
So I would say that the whole region is in a churn because American troops have withdrawn. They've also withdrawn without actually having set in train or laid any kind of real successor arrangement. So for 3 years, they've been negotiating with the Taliban. What they got was safe passage for their own troops. And in fact, the most poignant and telling instance of this is that the commander of the Baghran base left without informing the Afghans who were to take over. And of course, the base was looted to some extent. So that gives you a sense of how no one is really in charge in Afghanistan anymore. And we have seen that the Taliban, which is spread over the whole country, has moved rapidly. It has captured a number of districts. Many of these are districts that the government in Kabul may have decided to allow to be captured because they were distant, there's not a lot of population there, and they were not defensible, in other words. Some few places where the Taliban claim to have captured, especially border posts, the government says that they have been taken back from the Taliban. So there is a bit of back and forth, there is fighting, but as of now, it looks as if the Taliban are moving very rapidly, and nobody is really restraining them or being able to restrain them, except I would imagine, and it is still the expectation, that the Afghan National Army Special Forces will be much stronger in Kabul, around Kabul, and in some of the other important stages. What does it mean in terms of terrorism? The American president has said that they do not foresee a threat of terrorist activities to the United States from Pakistan because Al-Qaeda has been diminished and more or less finished off. Of course, there is much greater concern regarding the presence and perhaps the growth now of ISIS in Afghanistan. ISIS is of much greater concern to Russia, to China, and to the neighboring Central Asian states. It should be of great concern also to Pakistan, as it is of concern to India. But the scale and size of it at this moment is not clear. And certainly in India, we have not seen the government take a lot of positions on ISIS. I think along with terrorism, which could affect all the Central Asian states, and some of them actually have moved their armed forces to their borders towards Afghanistan because they are concerned about ISIS moving in. Connected with that is, of course, drug trafficking, and that has been a continuing concern, particularly for Russia. Connected with the terrorism issue is the concern of China regarding ETIM, which is an organization that has been designated a terrorist organization, but is seen as a fight for freedom, considering how horrific the situation for the Uyghurs has become in Xinjiang. It is no longer clear that everyone should see ETM or other resistance organizations in Xinjiang, considering that the reports and the research indicates that over 1 million Uyghurs have been incarcerated in camps. There are brainwashing techniques. There is an effort to force them to give up religious practices. There have been reports of women being sterilized against their wishes. The reports out of Xinjiang would indicate that any resistance from the Uyghurs cannot any longer be seen as terrorism by the rest of the world, at least. I think it has to be understood that terrorism and drugs are actually symbiotic. One funds the other. So this should be a matter of real concern for Pakistan, which in the past has also had very large numbers of addicts.
Can I just ask you, Neelam, to actually elaborate a little more on this particular aspect, which is the SCO at the conclusion of the foreign ministers' meeting had issued a document, which is, as I said, unexceptionable in terms of identifying the concerns that all the member states share. And as I said earlier, apart from Russia, China, India, Pakistan, we also have Iran and the other Central Asian states. So my specific query is that how can they translate this intent? The concern that is being expressed. For instance, even if Afghanistan now seems to be spiraling out of control or some parts thereof, there's a very complex geopolitical dynamic here. One is China has its domestic concern about Islamic terror, which you have just mentioned, in relation to how they are dealing with their own domestic Xinjiang and the Uyghur issue. But we also know that Russia is an old hand in terms of what is happening in Afghanistan and the region. They have their own concerns about Islamic terror. So how do you square the circle? Will the SCO provide boots on the ground? Will they beef up the ANA? Alternatively, can they strike a deal with the Taliban? So what can the SCO do in tangible terms, considering that counterterrorism was their top priority, if you remember when the SCO was conceived? So how do you see this panning out?
So I see it as trying to balance each other's interests. As I mentioned, the Central Asian states have actually moved their forces to their borders southwards. I don't know that there is any sincerity in terms of dealing with terrorism, because there is no agreement on what is terrorism. And certainly the Americans have for years, and we have seen President Ghani, just yesterday, lashing out at Pakistan for its support to terrorist activities as perpetrated by the Taliban within Afghanistan. So I'm not sure that these kind of anodyne agreements, and don't forget that Afghanistan is an observer at the SCO. So the Afghanistan government was also represented there. I don't think the expectation, my expectation would not be that any of these states are going to come together and engage in counterterrorism against activities emanating out of Afghanistan, because Pakistan has been a long time supporter, and that is a well-known fact. It is no longer a secret even in the United States, where the government itself, former presidents, present officials have spoken about the fact that while taking money from the United States, Pakistan actually promoted terrorist activities, which resulted in the killing of American and NATO soldiers. So I think it's a nice statement, and we must participate, because not being there makes it even less meaningful for India. But I would not put any eggs in that basket, especially because it is so dominated by China and Russia, which today have become very close. Eventually, there will be some level of difference amongst them when Russia sees China becoming an even more dominant player in what was its own backyard.
No, I think you actually put your finger on perhaps the most visible and critical anomaly, if I could put it that way, which is that inviting Pakistan to a conference on counterterrorism is perhaps the equivalent of inviting the fox to the hen coop. And this has been said many times. But of course, within Pakistan, there is also anguish saying that we are also victims of terrorism. But that is a different kind of domestic terrorism that has a sectarian kind of, shall we say, identity and trigger pulse. But let's leave this aside. I just want to move now to the connectivity issue, which is also related, because I think connectivity in Central Asia is something that even India has been deliberating upon for many years, many decades. Perhaps even when you were in service, I recall you were the Joint Secretary looking after BSM, right, at one time. And I'm sure that you were looking at the larger connectivity issue. And India often spoke about the Afghan route, that if we could somehow access Afghanistan and Central Asia and that whole debate with Pakistan. But now, with China BRI and the current level of turbulence / animation, how do you see connectivity? Because I think the agenda in Uzbekistan was very ambitious.
So I think connectivity is, of course, a buzzword. It's of interest to all governments. And you would remember that more than 20 years ago, there was talk about the TAPI pipeline from Turkmenistan through Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan into India. I think that, of course, did not come through, given the unfriendly relationship between India and Pakistan. India has made efforts, certainly to the east, but the efforts have been slow. They have been inadequate when compared with the speed and scale at which China has moved to build pipelines for oil and gas, to build roads, railway connectivity, all the way to Singapore on our east. And on the western side, connectivity is really, in many ways, a code word, if you like, for the CPEC, for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. You would recall that some years ago, China used to talk about how India can benefit from the CPEC, and there was a certain economic logic to building offshoots from the CPEC towards India, because that would make it economically viable. I think the estimates are that China has already invested $40 billion into Pakistan, mostly into the power sector, but also roads, rail links, and of course the port at Gwadar. Now, the viability of the port at Gwadar has been shown to be negative by the fact that Saudi Arabia just announced that they will not build a refinery at Gwadar, which had been the big hope for making it viable. I think that we have kept out of the CPEC, but we cannot ignore its implications for India. First of all, it went through territory that India claims. Secondly, it is mostly towards eastern Punjab, which is close to the Indian border. On the other hand, it is certainly beneficial for Pakistan in terms of having addressed its power shortages, but the price of electricity generated in Pakistan is so high that it is already unable to pay. So I would say that connectivity, and of course, India has been interested in access to Afghanistan, including through the Chabahar port from Iran. I think, again, we have not been able to move as rapidly as we may have liked, both under pressure from the Americans because of their relationship with Afghanistan, with Iran, but also because of our own financial and construction capacities in these areas, as well as, most importantly, the fact that Iran is a very difficult partner to negotiate with. It goes back and forth. It is just as capable of talking to us and talking to China at the same time. And in parts of that port, it has always come in saying that it is leaving India out and going to build it itself, and then basically hand it over to China. I think China is also dominant in Central Asia, having built up large infrastructure of pipelines, roads, railways. So this is really a way for China to further its interests in building up all these connectivities.
If I could be, slightly, shall we say, play the role of a devil's advocate, what I am very concerned about, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you have a sharper view of these issues, that for a long time, India's hurdle in accessing Central Asia was Pakistan. Then we invested considerably in Afghanistan during the war-torn years, and I think the Indian investment is almost $3 billion. We built the parliament, we had schools, hospitals, many development projects, because there was an aspiration that we could bypass Pakistan and use the Iran-Afghanistan route to be able to access Central Asia. The current churn, your word, churn in geopolitics has led to a situation where Afghanistan, with the Taliban in the driver's seat, would not be as favorably inclined to India as was the case in the past. Similarly, Iran is now a question mark, as you have pointed out, for its own domestic reasons. China's footprint is growing. So is India's space and the connectivity issue becoming that much more difficult? And the complexities are increasing: Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran. So Central Asia is actually becoming more elusive. Would that be a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I think that's the way you put it is kinder. I think India is out of that route as this axis between Russia, China, Iran becomes closer and closer because of unmitigated hostility from the United States and the incapacity of Europe, with all its wealth, to moderate that in any sense. Discussions on JCPOA have been going on since the day Biden became the president.
By that, the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, right?
Yeah, so nothing has moved forward. So I would say that India needs to recognize that, at least for the moment, route is not accessible, not available to us. We have also been slow in building up our equities in Central Asia. it is true that at this moment, nobody, not even the United States, can compete with the amount of investment that China puts in. Now, what we have and what can be meaningful is a close partnership with Japan to build up greater connectivity into the East through our own northeastern states, but also because Japan has stronger economic relationship with Iran. No country in the world, not even the smallest country in the world, wants to be beholden solely and only to China. Therefore, all countries would welcome India coming there and actually being able to do something substantive. The Quad, which is the quadrilateral, the US, Australia, Japan, and India, also has connectivity projects. They are more maritime in nature, but Japan is a very close partner. But again, we should not go in for wishful thinking. Japan and India have lost contracts, even in Sri Lanka, to China to build infrastructure. I think we should accept that and then move. Because once you accept a reality, then you can begin to change it. But for all the time that we don't accept it, we won't even be taking baby steps to change it.
Yeah, I think, again, that's a very lucid way of describing the challenge that India would have to, first of all, acknowledge and then see how to really review the options. But let me now come to the other issue which I had drawn attention to in my opening remarks, which is Afghanistan again, and the new connectivity that is likely to emerge, where China is the dominant player. Within Afghanistan, as and when this transition takes place, we are not quite sure how and when, but there have been some statements coming from the Taliban about how they propose to deal with the international community. But concurrently, some elements, because the Taliban does not yet represent a cohesive entity with a single leader, there are different statements coming from different groups. There was one that I saw last week, which really left me dismayed, which is that they made it very clear that as far as women and the girl child are concerned, that they would go back to their interpretation of the Islamic code, the Sharia. Now, that is what was imposed before 9/11. And both the women, the girl child, and I would say the moderate society in Afghanistan that was not aligned with the ideology of the Taliban are going to be very, very, I would say, vulnerable. So with your own interest in gender issues and development for women, etc., which is a very important aspect, how do you see this? I mean, to me, again, it's bleak, and I wish I had something cheerful to say or positive, but I'm not able to. Neelam?
So I would say it's even worse than what you might think. I think the Afghans, whichever their official spokesman, Shaheen, others who have spoken out, have all said that, of course, they are going to allow women and girls to do whatever within their Islamic religion and traditions. The traditions are not, frankly speaking, very progressive or useful for women. As a woman, I am not respectful of traditions in the way men often are, because those traditions have worked against the interests of women everywhere: Afghanistan, India, United States, Europe, wherever you like. We've already seen that Islamic punishment is back. There has been videos circulating of a robber's hands being chopped off as a Sharia punishment for robbery. We have seen the massacre of special forces, unarmed men who were called out from where they were holed up and then shot in cold blood, basically. I think we have to expect that once the Taliban are in power, if they are in power, and one must hope that they won't be there in the way that they were 20 years ago, I think the situation is going to be really bad. Now, it is a fact that for 20 years, Afghan boys and girls have grown up in a different setting. They have gone to schools, they have gone to university together. There are doctors, there are lawmakers, there are women in the public space women NGOs have played a really important role. I think in the end, it will come down not to whether women in Afghanistan will resist, but what young men in Afghanistan will do. If they are indeed different, as we would like to believe, then they have to be supportive of what happens to girls and women. And all over the world, it is not that women need to know about empowerment. Of course, girls want to be empowered. Of course, girls want to go to school. Of course, girls want a life without violence, and especially without domestic violence, without being violated by their own families. And now we will have to see what these boys and young men and their parents have learned in the 20 years when they had freedom. I'm not optimistic, I'm sorry to say, because they have had this opportunity once before when there was a communist government and when the Russians were in Afghanistan, when women were engineers, women were in every facet of public life. So I think for women, this is really a tragic situation. I also think it's really, it's very cynical that today President Bush, who invaded Afghanistan, talks about how sad he is about what will happen to women and girls. If they had concentrated on 20 years of actually building up Afghanistan, the situation might have been different today. But instead, America went into Iraq and its whole focus became Iraq. And the same, I think, will apply to all those who today are expressing concern about what's going to happen to women and girls.
Actually, I think I also, again, share your assessment and this lack of optimism. And I say this, with a lot of sadness and I would say a deep degree of disappointment that we have not been able to make that difference. And when I say we, I mean, one is, it's not just Afghanistan. You mentioned not only this part of the world, but even if you look at the so-called modern Western kind of, shall we say, societies and countries, the recent focus in the United States on Britney Spears and what she's being subjected to, I think, is just illustrative of this kind of double standards at play. But I think, one sort of sentence, one, remark that you made has just triggered this thought that if you look at the region in a 50-year cycle, we, I think, can remember, we are old enough to put it that way, to recall events of 1971. And you do a quick thumbnail review from 71 to 2021. Afghanistan, I recall, Kabul, along with Tehran, were considered to be the most chic capitals in this part of the world, only because their elites were connected with the rest of the global grid. And they were seen as, you mentioned Afghan women, Iranian women. They were engineers, they were doctors, they were teachers. And I remember seeing movies and documentaries about them. And fast forward, from 91 onwards, meaning from 71 to 91 is 20 years, and 91 to 2011, and where we are now, 2021, the conversions that Afghanistan has gone through, and their women in particular, I've had occasion to meet some of them in one of the local Delhi hospitals. Some of them are grandmothers. They come here with their grandchildren for treatment. And these are tragic stories. And these grandmothers, some of them speak English and they talk about their own younger days. So I think in that sense, the case study of Afghanistan is tragic about opportunities that have been lost. But I want to thank you, Neelam, for sharing, I think, some very deep insights, both in terms of the geopolitics and the other issues. And I do hope that we would be able to invite you again to security analysis.
Thank you.
On that note, allow me to thank our guest, Ambassador Neelam Deo, for her very insightful remarks. And alas, Afghanistan is still a happening place, but in a rather negative manner. And related to that, in as much as India is seeking to look at options, Central Asia is becoming even more dominated, if you will, by China and the equivalent of the China-Russia dyad. And India would have to move in a very astute manner in terms of the near future. On that note, Thank you for watching Security Analysis, and we will be back next week with another subject. Bye-bye and Jai Hind.